Now let's work on putting in some basic components. What components do we need if we look at our static thing? If you want to open up your static thing in the browser, you could just pick static HTML here and use that plugin that we've used to open in browser, which Mac, Command, Function F1, Control F1 on Windows. Once again, it opened it in the wrong place on mine. I'll just drag it right over. So here's my static one. So what do we have here? What kind of components would you make out of this? Yep. That white box in the center, which is a list of things. I'll call it ThingList. This could be a to-do list. It could be a list of groceries. It could be a list of people, whatever. It's just a list, so I'm just calling it ThingList. If you want to make yours more specific, feel free to name it something else. I'm gonna use ThingList. What else? So this stuff, ThingList, so many things. It's kind of a header, right? What else? Yeah. The add thing button. That's sort of our action. What else? Sign out. That button could be a separate component too. What about within this list, the individual items? Ooh, look at that. Fancy. So the way you did the links on Dwarf Underground, you could have the whole group of things be a component. And you could have each individual thing also be a component, right? I'm going to call that thing. So I'm going to start really, really simple. There's a little in the... I'm probably just going to leave the buttons out for now, and we'll add them after we add thing and thing list. So I think we're done with index.html probably. So let's look at app.js and see what we could do there. I'm going to get rid of all the stuff that's already in there. And just in the interest of getting something to show up, let's go ahead and put an H1 that says thing list and an H2 that says so many things. See if we can get that to show up. Here's my create React app thing. There we go. Thing list, so many things, is beautiful. We suggested moving that out to a header. Let's do it. So create a new file. Done with my public folder. Inside the source folder, create a new file. Call it header.js. We'll always need to import React. Do we talk about named imports and stuff? Did we do it in the morning? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure we did. So you may have noticed that sometimes, and I'm not doing it in this file, and you'll see why. Sometimes we might say import React and then component in curly braces like this. So that's because we can have default exports and named exports. We've been at the bottom of our components been saying export default, whatever our component's name is. So that means when we import from this file, whatever we say without curly braces around it is going to be whatever was exported as the default in that other file. You can also export things with names, like named constants, stuff like that, and do it with a name, in which case, to import that, you would say whatever the exported name was inside curly braces. And if you wanted to give it a different name than what it was exported as, because maybe you've got something else with the same name, you can say as, whatever. So just very briefly about putting named exports inside modules. So the reason that we sometimes import components separately from React is because, and I'm going to erase this so you don't need to copy this. You could say class my component extends. If we didn't import component directly, we would have to say react.component, which you've seen in some of the examples. But if we have, then we can just say component. We don't need react dot. In this case, we're not going to use either one. So importing React is adequate. Why aren't we using either one? Because this is going to be a functional stateless component, because it's not going to have any state. The header doesn't need any state. There's nothing to it. So let's say const header. And it's just going to be a function. We'll use an arrow function. And then all it needs to do is return some JSX. We don't need any logic to speak of. And then we'll make sure we export it. Export default header. What should this JSX be? Let's just make it this H1 and H2. Simple enough. But we can't quite do just that right, because there has to be one single element that everything's contained in for a given component. So we could just make a header. That's a valid HTML5 thing. ThingList, so many things. Then inside app, we can import it. Import header from header. .js is not required. This says headers defined but never used, because there's nothing inside this div anymore, right? So we can just use that component right inside this component. Capital H header, self-closing. Now we've got our H1 and H2. Now we could, before we go any further, go ahead and try to make the header not look awful. So how about we create, in the same folder, capital H header.css. And let's not forget to import it. Import header.css. So we need to pick some CSS out of our static CSS that we think should apply to these things. So what are these things? They're an H1 and an H2, which we did because there was an H1 and H2 over here inside static HTML, H1, H2. So let's look at static CSS in the other project and see what we have for H1 and H2. Here they are. We can just copy those, put them in header.css. save. All right. That's kind of close. Looks like it's the wrong font, though. Because over in static, it gives us Chonburi and Biorhyme. Cool names. Because look, we've got a Google Fonts import. Are these used anywhere else? It's only used there. That's only used there too. It says one of two, but I know that one of those is the import up here. So we could, if we wanted to, import this font right inside header CSS instead of putting it in app. So let's do that. Put that Google font up there. Save it. Got a problem. Unknown word. Oh, yeah, that's got a little problem in there. There's a style tag. Copy and paste error. That's my mistake. Oh, it looks like I had font awesome that I copied too. Okay, so here's the line I really want to copy. I'll just copy and paste that line into Slack since I did screw up the thing that you're copying it from. Save that. That's better. And now these are using the fonts that we expected. So our headings look right. Got a background color that isn't showing up. That probably belongs in app because that's the whole thing, right? So let's look at app CSS, which is already being imported. Okay, it's got this logo spin and all this stuff. We don't need any of this nonsense. I suppose we could align center by default, perhaps. Don't know if it's doing that in static. Doesn't look like it. We've got this background here. Let's try copying that over. So in app CSS, let's just say body, background. There we go. Now that looks about right. So we added just one rule to app CSS, added an import and two rules to header CSS. We added header.js. This is a very simple functional stateless component with just a header and two headings. Imported that into app.js and put it inside our JSX there. Cool. I'd say we've got a header. Add header component.